I carried my dinner tray through the kitchen like a maid in my own home, past the family dining table where my daughter and her husband sat eating the meal I'd prepared, and climbed the narrow back stairs to the cramped servants' quarters where Marcus had decided I belonged. The room was barely bigger than a closet, with a single bed, a lamp, and a window that looked out onto the neighbor's brick wall. As I sat on the edge of that bed, eating lukewarm soup from a chipped bowl, one realized this wasn't about convenience or space. This was about control. This was about erasing me from the house I'd built with my own hands, making me invisible in the home that still had my name on the deed. But what Marcus didn't know was that I'd already started documenting everything. Every humiliation, every degrading comment, every illegal move he'd made while playing Lord of the Manor. And by the time he realized what I was planning, those eviction papers would already be in his hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Alma Henderson, and I'm 74 years old. For the past 18 months, I've been living like a servant in the house I spent 30 years paying for, all because my daughter's husband decided that's where I belonged. Not in the guest room that used to be my sewing room, not in the master bedroom that held memories of my late husband Victor, but in the tiny servants' quarters tucked behind the kitchen that we'd used for storage since we moved in. I never thought I'd be telling this story, never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd let someone treat her like hired help in her own home. But grief does strange things to your judgment, and loneliness makes you accept situations you never would have tolerated before. When Victor passed 3 years ago, I thought I'd learned to live alone. I'd gotten used to making coffee for one, to eating dinner while watching the evening news, to going to bed in a house that felt too big and too quiet. I'd even started to find a rhythm in it, a kind of peace. Then Sarah called on a Tuesday morning in March, her voice shaky and desperate in a way I hadn't heard since she was 16, and had crashed Victor's truck into the mailbox. She was crying, which Sarah rarely did, and through the tears she told me that Marcus had lost his job at the architecture firm. Not laid off, not downsized, but fired for what she called creative differences. But what I suspected was something much worse. They were 3 months behind on rent for their downtown apartment, credit cards maxed out, and facing eviction within the week. Sarah had always been my soft spot, my only child, the little girl who used to help me plant marigolds in the front garden, and who'd insisted on wearing her Halloween costume to grocery stores well into November. When she asked if they could stay with me, just until Marcus gets back on his feet, I didn't hesitate. I told her to pack their things and come home. I cleared out the guest room, stocked the refrigerator, and convinced myself that having family in the house again might fill some of the emptiness Victor had left behind. What I didn't anticipate was Marcus. I'd met him 3 times before the wedding, and each encounter had left me with the same uneasy feeling you get when you realize someone is performing sincerity rather than feeling it. He was handsome in a calculated way, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He worked in architecture, he said, specialized in sustainable design, and had big plans for revolutionizing urban housing. He spoke in buzzwords and grand gestures, and I could see why Sarah was charmed. She'd always been drawn to confidence, even when it was hollow. But living with Marcus was different than meeting him across a dinner table. Within the first week, I noticed how he moved through my house like he was conducting an inspection, running his fingers along windowsills, examining the crown molding, commenting on the dated fixtures and inefficient layout. He'd stand in the living room with his arms crossed, shaking his head at the floral wallpaper I'd chosen when Sarah was still in high school, muttering about wasted potential and missed opportunities. Sarah seemed oblivious to his critiques, or maybe she'd learned to tune them out. She was dealing with her own stress, spending hours on her laptop applying for marketing positions while Marcus sat on my couch, scrolling through his phone and complaining about the limited opportunities in our backwards town. He'd been out of work for 6 months, not 2 weeks like Sarah had initially told me, and his daily routine consisted of sleeping until noon, eating the breakfast I'd prepared, and holding court in my living room while Sarah job hunted upstairs. The first month wasn't terrible. Uncomfortable, yes, and more expensive than I'd planned, since Marcus had expensive tastes in everything from coffee to toiletries, but manageable. I told myself it was temporary, that things would improve once one of them found work. I made dinner every night, did their laundry, and tried to give them space to work through their financial problems without adding to their stress. But by the second month, something had shifted. Marcus had stopped pretending to look for jobs, and had started acting like my house was his personal project. He'd rearranged the furniture in the living room without asking, claiming it would, quote, improve the flow. He'd thrown away half the contents of my spice cabinet, calling them expired, even though most were perfectly fine. He'd taken over the garage, spreading his drafting supplies across my workbench, and hanging architectural drawings on the pegboard where Victor's tools used to hang. When I mentioned that I'd like to use the garage for my car again, Marcus looked at me with the kind of patient condescension you'd show a child who'd asked for ice cream for breakfast. "Alma," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern, "you barely drive anymore. The garage is much better used as a workspace. Besides, cars are meant to handle weather. That's what they're designed for." I wanted to argue, to point out that it was my garage, my car, my house, but Sarah was standing right there looking exhausted and fragile, and I couldn't bring myself to start a fight that might push them out before they were ready. So I nodded and moved my car to the driveway, where it sat collecting pollen and bird droppings while Marcus spread his unemployment across my late husband's workspace. The real problems started in month 3, when Marcus began treating me less like Sarah's mother and more like hired help. It began with small requests that felt reasonable on the surface. Could I pick up his dry cleaning since I was already going to town? Could I handle the grocery shopping since I knew the stores better? Could I start dinner a little earlier since he liked to eat at 5:30 sharp? Each request came with a logical explanation, a reasonable justification that made me feel petty for hesitating. But the requests multiplied, and the explanations became more elaborate, more condescending. Soon I was doing all the shopping, all the cooking, all the cleaning, while Marcus held meetings in my living room with potential business partners, who never seemed to materialize into actual work. The worst part was watching Sarah transform from my independent, capable daughter into someone who deferred to Marcus on every decision. She'd stopped making eye contact with me during conversations, stopped asking for my opinion on anything beyond meal planning. When I'd suggest family activities or mention missing our old Saturday morning coffee dates, she'd glance at Marcus before responding, as if she needed his permission to spend time with her own mother. I started to feel like a stranger in my own home, tiptoeing around Marcus's schedule and preferences, afraid to disturb his important work or interrupt his phone calls with people who seemed to exist only to validate his grandiose plans. My morning coffee ritual moved from the kitchen table to the back porch because Marcus liked to have his breakfast in complete quiet. My evening television time shifted to the small TV in the guest room because Marcus needed the living room for his quote, 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 quote. But the moment I knew things had crossed a line was the day Marcus decided I should move to the servants' quarters. It was a Thursday in late June, and I'd been battling a summer cold that left me exhausted and congested. I'd spent the morning cleaning the house for Sarah's birthday dinner, preparing her favorite meal of lamb chops and roasted vegetables, and setting up the dining room with the good china Victor and I had received as a wedding gift. I'd even bought flowers for the centerpiece, and wrapped the bracelet I'd chosen for Sarah's gift. Around 3 o'clock, I was finally feeling human enough to take a shower when Marcus knocked on my bedroom door. When I opened it, he was standing there with a manila folder, and the kind of serious expression he usually reserved for his phone calls with imaginary investors. "Alma," he said, stepping into my room without being invited, "we need to talk about the living situation." I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my robe, feeling suddenly vulnerable and exposed. Marcus remained standing, looking down at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sarah and I have been discussing our long-term plans," he continued, opening the folder and pulling out what looked like architectural drawings. "We're grateful for your hospitality, but we think it's time to optimize the space more efficiently." He spread the drawings across my dresser, and I could see they were floor plans of my house, but altered, redesigned, with walls moved and rooms repurposed. My sewing room had become a home office. The guest room had been expanded into a master suite. And my bedroom, the room I'd shared with Victor for over 20 years, had been labeled secondary living space. "The thing is," Marcus said, his voice taking on that patient, educational tone I'd grown to hate, "this house has tremendous potential, but the current layout isn't maximizing its value. The master bedroom suite should be upstairs, where it gets the best light and has the most privacy. The main floor should be for entertaining and working.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I stared at the drawings, trying to process what he was suggesting. Marcus, this is my bedroom. Victor and I understand the sentimental value, he interrupted, but sentiment doesn't increase property value. Sarah and I are planning to settle here long term, maybe start a family eventually. We need space that reflects our future, not the past. My hands started shaking, and I wasn't sure if it was from the cold medicine or from anger. Are you asking me to give up my bedroom? Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. I'm suggesting we reorganize the space to better serve everyone's needs. The servants' quarters behind the kitchen are actually quite charming. They're private, quiet, and they have their own entrance. You'd have complete independence while still being part of the household. I looked at the drawings again, and I could see he'd labeled the tiny room behind the kitchen as Alma's suite. Suite. As if calling it something fancy would make it less degrading. The servants' quarters, I said slowly. You want me to live in the servants' quarters. I want you to live in the space that makes the most sense for your current needs, he corrected. You don't need a large room anymore. You don't entertain guests. You don't need the master bathroom with the double sinks and the garden tub. The servants' quarters have everything you actually use. A bed, a small closet, a window. It's practical. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him exactly what I thought of his practical suggestions and his architectural drawings and his complete lack of respect for the woman who'd been supporting him for months. But Sarah appeared in the doorway, looking uncertain and tired. Mom? She said quietly. Are you okay? I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw someone I barely recognized. The confident young woman who'd graduated summa cum laude from college had been replaced by someone who seemed afraid of her own shadow. She was thinner than I'd ever seen her, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervous energy that made her fidget with her wedding ring. Sarah, I said carefully, did you know about this? She glanced at Marcus, then back at me, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. Marcus thinks it would be better for everyone if we had more space. And the servants' quarters are actually really nice, Mom. They're cozy. Cozy? My daughter, who'd grown up in this house, who'd had birthday parties in the backyard and Christmas mornings in the living room, was calling the servants' quarters cozy. Where am I supposed to put my things? I asked, gesturing toward the bedroom that held 30 years of memories. My furniture? My clothes? Victor's books? Marcus consulted his drawings. There's a storage unit facility about 10 minutes from here. Very reasonable rates. You can keep the sentimental items there and just bring what you actually need into your new space. My new space. The servants' quarters. The room where the previous owners had housed their live-in help, complete with a separate entrance so the staff wouldn't disturb the family. I looked at Sarah again, hoping to see some sign of the daughter I'd raised, some indication that she understood how wrong this was. But she was staring at the floor, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. When? I asked finally. Well, Marcus said, rolling up the drawings with obvious satisfaction. Sarah's birthday dinner is tonight, and we don't want to disrupt that. But maybe this weekend? Give you time to sort through things and decide what you want to keep versus what you want to store. I nodded, because I couldn't trust my voice to stay steady. Marcus left the room, taking his drawings and his condescending smile with him. Sarah lingered in the doorway, and for a moment I thought she might apologize, might acknowledge how insane this all was. Instead, she said, The servants' quarters really are nice, Mom, and you'll still be here with us. We're still family. Then she left too, and I sat alone in my bedroom, the bedroom I'd shared with Victor, the room where I'd nursed Sarah through childhood illnesses, and where I'd grieved my husband's death, and realized that my daughter's husband had just convinced her to help him evict me from my own life. That night, I served Sarah's birthday dinner in the dining room, using the good china and the crystal glasses that had been wedding gifts from my mother. I smiled and made conversation and pretended everything was normal while Marcus held court at the head of the table, in the chair that had been Victor's, describing his plans for improving the house. The whole place has such potential, he said, cutting into his lamb chop with obvious relish. With some strategic renovations, we could increase the value by at least 40%. New kitchen, updated bathrooms, maybe add a deck off the back. Turn this into a real showplace. Sarah nodded eagerly, caught up in his vision of their future in my house. And the servants' quarters will be perfect for Mom. She'll have her own space, her own entrance. It's like having a mother-in-law suite. A mother-in-law suite. That's what we were calling it now. I excused myself early, claiming I was still feeling under the weather, and climbed the stairs to my bedroom for what I thought might be the last time. I sat on the edge of the bed Victor and I had shared for over 20 years, surrounded by photographs and mementos, and the accumulated evidence of a life well lived, and felt something cold and determined settle in my chest. Marcus thought he was clever, thought he'd found a way to take over my house by making me feel like a burden, like an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. He'd counted on my love for Sarah to keep me compliant, my grief to keep me vulnerable, my age to keep me from fighting back. But what Marcus didn't understand was that I'd built this house from nothing. I'd worked 2 jobs to help Victor make the mortgage payments. I'd saved every penny for 30 years to pay it off early. I'd maintained it, improved it, and turned it into a home that was worth 3 times what we'd paid for it. My name was on the deed, my signature was on the insurance policy, and my sweat equity was in every room. And if Marcus thought he could shuffle me off to the servants' quarters like some obsolete piece of furniture, he was about to learn exactly what this obsolete piece of furniture was capable of. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and made coffee in the kitchen that would soon be Marcus's domain. I sat at the table where I'd eaten breakfast for 30 years, watching the sun rise through the window I'd watched it rise through every morning since Sarah was in elementary school, and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't moving to the servants' quarters. I was staying right where I belonged. And if Marcus wanted to play games with my house, he was going to learn that I'd been playing this game a lot longer than he had. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. Janet Morrison had handled Victor's estate, and she'd been a family friend for over 15 years. She knew the history of the house, knew how hard Victor and I had worked to build our life here, and when I explained what Marcus was trying to do, her response was immediate and unequivocal. "Alma," she said, her voice sharp with anger, "he can't do that. It's your house. Your name is on the deed. He has no legal right to dictate where you live in your own home." "But what about Sarah?" I asked. "She's my daughter. Doesn't she have some claim?" "Not unless you've signed something giving her ownership, which I know you haven't because I would have prepared those documents. Sarah is a guest in your home, and so is her husband. Guests don't get to reassign the bedrooms." Janet scheduled an appointment for that afternoon, and I spent the morning doing something I hadn't done in months. I went shopping for myself. I bought new sheets for my bed, new towels for my bathroom, and a bottle of wine to celebrate what I was starting to think of as my emancipation. When I got home, Marcus was in the living room with his laptop, surrounded by real estate listings and renovation websites. He looked up when I walked in with my shopping bags, and I could see the surprise in his eyes. "Doing some shopping?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just a few things for my bedroom," I said, emphasizing the word my, just enough to make my point. Something flickered across his face, but he recovered quickly. "About that," he said, closing his laptop and giving me his full attention. "I was thinking we could start the transition this weekend. I've already found a storage unit, and I can help you move the heavier pieces." I set my bags down and looked at him directly. "Marcus, I've been thinking about your suggestion, and I've decided I'm not interested." His smile faltered slightly. "Not interested in what?" "In moving to the servants' quarters. In reorganizing my house to suit your preferences. In storing my belongings so you can have more space." I kept my voice calm, pleasant even, but I could see the effect my words were having. "Alma," he said, standing up and moving closer, "I think you're misunderstanding the situation. This isn't really a choice. The current arrangement isn't working for anyone." "It's working fine for me," I said. "It's my house, Marcus. My name is on the deed. I'll live wherever I choose to live in it." That's when I saw the real Marcus for the first time. The mask of polite condescension slipped, and what I saw underneath was something cold and calculating, and completely without compassion. "You're being unreasonable," he said, his voice losing its fake warmth. "Sarah and I are trying to build a life here. We're planning for the future. You're holding us back with your selfish attachment to the past." Sarah can build whatever life she wants, I said, but she'll build it somewhere else. This is my house, and I'm not moving to the servants' quarters to accommodate your architectural fantasies. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. Then he smiled, but it wasn't the performance smile he usually wore. This was something sharper, more predatory. We'll see about that, he said quietly. That afternoon, I met with Janet and signed papers that would protect my interests and establish clear boundaries about who had authority in my house. I also started a file folder, something I'd label documentation and fill with evidence of every conversation, every demand, every attempt to manipulate or control me. But when I got home, I found Marcus and Sarah in the kitchen, and I could tell from Sarah's red eyes that she'd been crying. "Mom," she said as soon as I walked in, "we need to talk." I sat down at the table and Marcus remained standing, looming over both of us in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. "Sarah's been very upset," Marcus said, his voice taking on that patient, reasonable tone that always preceded his worst behavior. "She's caught between her loyalty to you and her commitment to our marriage. It's not fair to put her in this position." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw someone who'd been worn down by months of manipulation and emotional pressure. She was thin, exhausted, and so tense she seemed to vibrate with anxiety. "What position?" I asked. Sarah glanced at Marcus, then back at me. "Mom, Marcus says you're not willing to compromise, that you're being stubborn about the living arrangements." "I'm being stubborn about not moving to the servants' quarters in my own house," I said. "Yes, I suppose I am." "But it's not just about the room," Sarah said, her voice getting higher and more strained. "It's about respect. Marcus feels like you don't respect our marriage, our plans, our future." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Sarah, what has he told you?" Marcus put his hand on Sarah's shoulder, and I watched her lean into it like she was seeking shelter. "I've told her the truth," he said. "That you're making it impossible for us to build a life here. That you're treating this house like a museum instead of a home. That you're prioritizing your comfort over your daughter's happiness." "My comfort?" I stood up, anger finally breaking through the careful control I'd been maintaining. "My comfort? Marcus, I've been cooking every meal, doing every load of laundry, paying every grocery bill, and covering every utility payment for 6 months. I've given up my garage, my living room, my kitchen table, and my peace of mind to make you comfortable. And now you want me to give up my bedroom so you can have a master suite in my house? You see?" Marcus said to Sarah, his voice heavy with manufactured disappointment. "This is exactly what I mean. Everything is about ownership with her. My house, my bedroom, my kitchen. She can't see past her own selfishness to understand what we need." Sarah was crying now, and I realized with a sick feeling that Marcus had been working on her for weeks, maybe months, building a case against me in her mind, making her believe that I was the problem, that I was the one being unreasonable. "Mom," Sarah said through her tears, "maybe the servants' quarters wouldn't be so bad. Just temporarily. Just until we can figure out something else." And that's when I knew I'd lost her, at least for now. Marcus had succeeded in turning my daughter against me, convincing her that my refusal to be demoted to hired help in my own home was somehow an act of selfishness rather than self-preservation. "Fine," I said quietly. "If that's what you want, Sarah. If that's what would make you happy." Marcus smiled, his victory obvious and complete. "I think it's the right choice for everyone," he said. "You'll see. The servants' quarters are actually quite nice." That night, I packed a small bag with essentials and moved into the servants' quarters. The room was exactly as I'd remembered it. Tiny, dark, with a window that looked out onto the neighbor's brick wall and a door that opened directly onto the kitchen. It had been used for storage for years, and despite my cleaning efforts, it still smelled faintly of old cardboard and dust. I sat on the narrow bed, surrounded by the accumulated junk of 30 years, and realized that Marcus had won this round. But what he didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything, recording every conversation, and building a case that would prove he'd been systematically abusing and manipulating not just me, but my daughter as well. And while he celebrated his victory in my bedroom, sleeping in my bed and using my bathroom, I was planning something that would give me back everything he'd taken, and more. The servants' quarters might be where I was sleeping, but the house was still mine. And I was about to remind Marcus exactly what that meant. The first morning I woke up in the servants' quarters, I couldn't tell where I was for a disorienting moment. The ceiling was too low, the light was wrong, and instead of the familiar view of my garden through my bedroom window, I was staring at a brick wall 2 feet away. Then reality crashed back, and I remembered that I was now living in what amounted to a storage closet while Marcus stretched out in my king-sized bed upstairs. I could hear him already, moving around in my bathroom, running water in my shower, probably using the expensive shampoo I'd bought the week before he decided I belonged in the help's quarters. The walls in this old house were thin, and the servants' quarters had been designed so the help could hear when they were needed, which meant I could hear everything happening in the main house. Every footstep, every conversation, every intimate moment between my daughter and the man who'd systematically stripped away my dignity. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now literally listening to my life from below stairs, like some character in a Victorian novel about the class divide. Except this wasn't fiction, and I wasn't actually the help. I was a 74-year-old woman who owned every brick of this house, being treated like domestic staff by a man who couldn't even pay his own rent. I made coffee in the tiny kitchenette that had been installed in the servants' quarters sometime in the 1950s. A 2-burner hot plate, and a mini refrigerator that hummed constantly and barely kept milk cold. The coffee tasted bitter, nothing like the rich blend I used to make in my proper kitchen with the machine Victor had bought me for our 25th anniversary. But this wasn't about coffee. This was about survival, and I was quickly learning that survival required adapting to circumstances while planning your escape. Around 7:30, I heard Sarah's voice in the kitchen above, talking to Marcus in the bright, cheerful tone she'd started using whenever she spoke to him. It was the voice of someone trying very hard to keep peace, to avoid saying anything that might trigger an argument or disappointment. I'd heard that tone before, from women at church whose husbands controlled every aspect of their lives, and it made my stomach turn to hear it coming from my independent, college-educated daughter. "Do you think Mom's okay down there?" Sarah asked, and I could hear the genuine concern in her voice beneath the careful modulation. Marcus's response was immediate and dismissive. "She's fine. She's just adjusting. Change is hard for older people, but she'll get used to it. Besides, she has everything she needs." Everything I needed. A bed, a hot plate, and a view of brick. Marcus's definition of what I needed was apparently quite different from my own. "Maybe I should check on her," Sarah said. "Make sure she has enough blankets, or see if she wants to join us for breakfast." "Sarah." Marcus's voice took on that patient, lecturing tone I'd grown to hate. "Your mother is perfectly capable of taking care of herself. If she needs something, she knows where to find us. But constantly checking on her sends the message that you don't trust her independence. Is that really what you want to communicate?" The manipulation was so smooth, so perfectly calculated, that I almost admired it in a sick way. Marcus had managed to frame my daughter's natural concern for my welfare as somehow harmful to my dignity. He'd convinced her that ignoring me was actually a form of respect. I heard Sarah's footsteps retreat, and then the sound of breakfast being prepared in my kitchen. The kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals over the years, where I'd taught Sarah to make pancakes and helped her with homework at the counter. Now I was listening to my daughter and her husband discuss their day while I sat in exile, drinking bitter coffee from a chipped mug. That's when I made my second decision. If Marcus wanted to treat me like the help, I was going to start acting like the help. But not in the way he expected. I'd worked as a domestic when I was first married to Victor, cleaning houses for wealthy families while he established his plumbing business. I knew how the help really operated, and it wasn't with the cheerful subservience Marcus imagined. The best domestic workers were observant, careful, and absolutely thorough in documenting everything they saw and heard. They knew their employers' secrets, their habits, their vulnerabilities, and they protected themselves by keeping meticulous records of everything that happened under their watch. I finished my coffee, got dressed in my most practical clothes, and walked through the servants' entrance into the main kitchen, where Marcus and Sarah were eating the breakfast I would have normally prepared. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, moving to the sink to wash my coffee cup. Marcus looked up from his Eggs Benedict, which he'd apparently made himself, though I noticed he'd used the good china, and left the pan soaking in the sink for someone else to clean. "Morning, Alma," he said with that fake warmth he used when he wanted to demonstrate his magnanimity. How did you sleep? Is the room working out for you? It's fine, I said, drying my cup and putting it away. Just getting adjusted to the acoustics. These old houses carry sound in interesting ways. Something flickered across his face, and I could see him processing what I'd just told him. That I could hear everything happening in the house. Every conversation, every argument, every private moment. Information was power, and I just let him know I had access to information he might not want me to have. Sarah looked uncomfortable, pushing her eggs around her plate without eating them. Mom, would you like me to make you some breakfast? There's plenty. Thank you, sweetheart, but I've already eaten, I lied smoothly. I'm an early riser, remember? But I was wondering if you'd like me to tidy up while I'm here. I know you both have busy days ahead. Marcus set down his fork and studied me carefully. That's very thoughtful, Alma. But we can handle our own cleanup. You don't need to feel obligated to do housework. Oh, it's no obligation, I said with a smile. I like to keep busy, and since I'm living here now, I might as well contribute where I can. What I didn't say was that contributing where I could meant having access to every room in the house, every document, every piece of mail, every private conversation that took place when they thought I was safely tucked away in the servants' quarters. If Marcus wanted to treat me like domestic staff, he was going to get all the benefits that came with having someone invisible moving through his life. I spent that first day learning the new dynamics of my own house. Marcus had indeed taken over completely, rearranging furniture, claiming the best chair in the living room, spreading his papers across the dining room table like he was running a business empire instead of collecting unemployment checks. He'd moved Victor's books out of the study and replaced them with his architectural magazines and design portfolios. He'd even changed the thermostat settings, keeping the house cooler than I preferred and warmer than was economical. But more importantly, I learned his patterns. Marcus was a creature of habit, and habits create vulnerabilities. He checked his email at exactly 9:15 every morning, scrolling through what appeared to be mostly rejection letters from potential employers. He made phone calls from the back porch at 11, always the same 3 numbers, always ending in frustration. He napped every afternoon from 2 to 3:30, sleeping so soundly that he snored loud enough to be heard 2 rooms away. And every evening at 6, he disappeared into what used to be my sewing room for exactly 1 hour, emerging with a satisfaction that suggested he was doing something he considered important or pleasurable. The room was locked during these sessions, which was interesting since none of the interior doors in my house had ever had working locks before. I started keeping a notebook, writing down everything I observed in the careful, detailed manner I'd learned during my years working for other people. Timestamps, direct quotes, behavioral patterns, financial observations. Marcus might think I was a harmless old woman who'd accepted her diminished status, but I was actually conducting a thorough investigation of the man who'd invaded my life. The second day brought the first test of my new strategy. I was cleaning the living room, dusting the furniture that Marcus had rearranged, when I heard him talking on the phone in the kitchen. His voice was lower than usual, more secretive, and I moved closer to the connecting doorway to listen. No, she's not a problem anymore, he was saying. We've got her settled in the servants' quarters. She's actually being quite cooperative about the whole thing. There was a pause while whoever he was talking to responded. Trust me, Jerry, she's not going to cause any issues. She's old, she's lonely, and she's grateful to have family around. She'll do whatever Sarah asks her to do, and Sarah does whatever I tell her is best. Another pause. The house? Yeah, it's perfect. Great bones. Excellent location. Tons of potential. I'm thinking we could flip it for at least $400,000 profit once we get the old lady out of the picture. Sarah doesn't know yet, but I'm already talking to contractors about the renovations. My blood turned to ice water. Marcus wasn't just trying to control my living situation. He was planning to sell my house, apparently without my knowledge or consent, and pocket the profits. And he was discussing this plan with someone named Jerry, who seemed to be offering advice on how to accomplish this theft. The beauty of it is that Sarah thinks this is all about creating space for our future family, Marcus continued, and I could hear the smugness in his voice. She has no idea I'm planning to cash out and move us somewhere better, somewhere that reflects our actual worth, instead of this dated suburban museum. I stood frozen behind the doorway, my dusting cloth clutched in my trembling hand, as Marcus outlined his plan to steal my house and manipulate my daughter into helping him do it. But even as the shock and rage washed over me, part of my mind stayed cold and analytical. This was evidence. This was proof of his intentions, his methods, his complete lack of regard for both Sarah and me. 6 months, Marcus said. Maybe less if I can convince Sarah that her mother would be happier in assisted living. Once we get her into a facility, we can claim power of attorney for health reasons and handle the property transfer ourselves. Power of attorney. Assisted living. Property transfer. The words hit me like physical blows, but I forced myself to keep listening, to memorize every detail of this conversation that revealed the full scope of Marcus's plans. Jerry, relax. I've got this handled. Sarah trusts me completely, and the old lady is already living like hired help. By Christmas, this place will be on the market, and we'll be looking at condos in the city. When Marcus finally hung up, I slipped back to the living room and continued dusting, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the cloth. But my mind was crystal clear. Marcus wasn't just a lazy, manipulative house guest. He was a predator who'd targeted my daughters specifically to gain access to my property, and he was planning to destroy both our lives to enrich himself. I finished cleaning in a daze, going through the motions while my thoughts raced. Everything made sense now. Marcus's sudden interest in Sarah after years of casual dating. His immediate financial crisis that conveniently required moving into my house. His architectural expertise that allowed him to assess the property's value and potential. His systematic campaign to isolate me from my daughter and diminish my status in my own home. This wasn't random. This was a carefully planned con game, and Sarah and I were the marks. That afternoon, while Marcus took his regular nap, I called Janet from the phone in the servants' quarters, keeping my voice low, even though I could hear him snoring upstairs. Janet, I need to see you today. It's urgent. Alma, what's wrong? You sound upset. I can't talk about it over the phone. Can you meet me somewhere? Somewhere Marcus won't see us? Janet agreed to meet me at the coffee shop downtown, and I slipped out through the servants' entrance while Marcus slept and Sarah was at a job interview. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was moving towards solving my problems, instead of just enduring them. Janet took one look at my face and ordered 2 large coffees and a plate of pastries, settling us into a corner booth where we couldn't be overheard. Tell me everything, she said simply. I told her about the phone conversation I'd overheard, about Marcus's plan to sell my house and move me into assisted living, about his manipulation of Sarah and his systematic takeover of my property. Janet took notes, asked questions, and grew more grim with each detail. Alma, she said finally, what Marcus is planning is fraud. Financial elder abuse. If he attempts to claim power of attorney without your consent, or tries to transfer property that belongs to you, he'll be committing serious crimes. But what about Sarah? I asked. She's part of this, even if she doesn't know what Marcus is really planning. What happens to her when this all comes out? Janet leaned back in her chair, studying my face. Sarah is a victim, too. Marcus has been manipulating her, isolating her from you, controlling her perception of reality. When the truth comes out, she's going to need support, not punishment. So what do? You document everything. Every conversation, every demand, every attempt to control you or your property. You keep detailed records of his behavior, his statements, his plans. And when you have enough evidence, we take it to the authorities and let them handle Marcus legally. How long will that take? Depends on how quickly Marcus moves forward with his plans. If he tries to forge documents or claim power of attorney, we can stop him immediately. If he's planning to wait 6 months, we have time to build an airtight case. I thought about living in the servants' quarters for 6 more months, pretending to be compliant, while Marcus destroyed my daughter's emotional health and planned to steal my life's work. Janet, I can't do this for 6 months. I can't watch him manipulate Sarah for that long. And I can't keep living like a prisoner in my own house. Then we need to force his hand, Janet said thoughtfully. Make him move faster than he's comfortable with. Make him make mistakes that expose his true intentions. How? Janet smiled, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. by giving him exactly what he thinks he wants, and then pulling the rug out from under him when he tries to take it. We spent the next hour planning a strategy that would expose Marcus's true nature and protect both Sarah and me from his manipulations. It was risky, and it would require me to continue playing the role of the defeated old woman for a while longer. But it would also give me the evidence I needed to destroy Marcus's plans and reclaim my life. When I got home, Marcus was in the kitchen, making himself a late lunch, using ingredients I'd bought and dishes I'd have to wash later. "Where were you?" he asked casually, but I could hear the edge in his voice. "Just running errands," I said pleasantly. "Getting used to my new schedule." "What kind of errands?" I smiled at him, the same harmless smile I'd been practicing for weeks. "Oh, just old lady things. You know how it is." Marcus studied my face for a moment, looking for signs of deception or defiance. But I'd spent years working for people who considered me invisible, and I knew how to look completely harmless while hiding everything that mattered. "Well," he said finally, "Sarah should be home soon. She had a job interview today." "I hope it went well," I said sincerely. "She deserves to find something that makes her happy." "She will," Marcus said, and there was something cold in his voice that made me think he'd already decided what would make Sarah happy, regardless of what she wanted. That evening, Sarah came home exhausted and discouraged. The job interview had gone well, but they'd told her they were interviewing several candidates and wouldn't make a decision for 2 weeks. She sat at the kitchen table, still in her interview clothes, looking defeated. "I don't know what we're going to do if I don't get this job," she said to Marcus, who was scrolling through his phone instead of offering comfort. "We can't keep living off Mom's generosity forever." "Don't worry about it," Marcus said without looking up. "Something will work out. It always does." I was washing dishes at the sink, invisible in the way domestic help becomes invisible, and I could see Sarah's face in the reflection from the window. She looked hurt by Marcus's casual dismissal of her concerns, confused by his apparent lack of urgency about their financial situation. "But Marcus, what if I don't get it? What if nobody hires me? We don't have any savings left, and—" "Sarah," Marcus's voice cut her off sharply. I said, "Don't worry about it. I'm handling our long-term planning. You just focus on the short-term stuff." "Long-term planning? Like selling my house and putting me in a facility?" Sarah fell silent, but I could see the questions in her eyes, the growing awareness that something wasn't quite right about Marcus's confidence in their financial future. She was starting to notice the inconsistencies in his behavior, the way he seemed unconcerned about money while she stressed about every bill. That night, I lay in my narrow bed in the servants' quarters, listening to the sounds of my house settling around me. Above me, I could hear Sarah and Marcus moving around in my bedroom, getting ready for bed in the space that had been mine for over 20 years. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel defeated. I felt dangerous. Marcus thought he'd neutralized me, turned me into a harmless old woman who'd accepted her diminished circumstances. He had no idea that I was documenting his every move, recording his conversations, and building a case that would expose him as the predator he really was. And tomorrow, I was going to start giving him exactly what he thought he wanted, so he'd reveal exactly who he really was. The third day of my life in the servants' quarters began with an unexpected opportunity. I woke early, as had become my habit, and was making coffee in my tiny kitchenette when I heard Marcus's phone ring upstairs. His voice carried clearly through the thin walls, and I could tell immediately that this was one of his important calls. "Jerry, finally," Marcus said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "I was starting to think you'd changed your mind." I moved closer to the connecting wall, pressing my ear against it to catch every word. "Yeah, she's completely under control now, living in the servants' quarters like I told you. Sarah doesn't even question it anymore. She thinks it's normal." There was a long pause while Jerry spoke. No problems with the property research. Clean title, no liens, estimated value between $750,000 and $800,000 depending on renovations. The location alone makes it worth the investment. My house was worth nearly $800,000. I'd known it had appreciated significantly, but hearing Marcus discuss it like a commodity he was planning to acquire made my stomach turn. The timeline? I'm thinking we move faster than originally planned. The old lady is more compliant than I expected, And Sarah's getting desperate about money. If I can convince her that we need to make some hard decisions about her mother's care, we could have power of attorney within a month. A month. Marcus was planning to have me declared incompetent and steal my house within a month. Trust me, Jerry. I've done this before. Find a lonely widow with valuable property, get close to the family, create a crisis that requires intervention, then step in as the solution. It's all about timing and presentation. Done this before. Marcus had done this before. I wasn't his first victim. Sarah's the perfect mark for this. She's isolated, financially dependent, and desperate to believe that someone loves her enough to take care of everything. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her if I frame it as protecting her mother. I felt sick. Not just at Marcus's casual cruelty toward me, but at his complete contempt for my daughter, Sarah, who'd fallen in love with a man who saw her as nothing more than a tool to steal from her family. The documentation is already started. I've got a doctor who'll testify that the living arrangement shows signs of diminished capacity. Moving an elderly person to servants' quarters is apparently a classic indicator of cognitive decline. A doctor who'll testify. Marcus had already found someone willing to provide false medical testimony to support his theft of my property. Once we get the power of attorney, we'll have about 6 months before anyone starts asking questions. Plenty of time to transfer the property and liquidate the assets. By the time any family members figure out what happened, we'll be long gone with clean money. Clean money. Money stolen from elderly women who'd trusted their families. Marcus's conversation continued for another 10 minutes, covering details about falsified medical records, forged documents, and the network of accomplices who helped him steal from vulnerable seniors. By the time he hung up, I had enough information to destroy him completely, but I also had something more valuable than evidence. I had clarity. Marcus wasn't just a lazy opportunist who'd stumbled into a chance to take advantage of me. He was a professional con artist who specialized in targeting elderly women through their children. Sarah wasn't his girlfriend who'd happened to need help. She was his mark, carefully chosen and systematically manipulated to give him access to my property. And I wasn't his first victim. Somewhere out there were other women who'd lost their homes, their savings, their families, because Marcus had identified them as targets and deployed his charm against their children. I thought about those other women as I got dressed and prepared for another day of playing the compliant victim. How many had ended up in nursing homes, bewildered and heartbroken, while Marcus sold their life's work and disappeared with the profits? How many daughters had been left to discover too late that the man they'd trusted had destroyed their mothers? I wasn't going to be another statistic in Marcus's criminal career. I slipped out through the servants' entrance and walked to the corner store, where I bought a small digital recorder that would fit in my pocket. If Marcus wanted to make incriminating phone calls within earshot of my living quarters, I was going to make sure every word was preserved for the authorities. When I got back to the house, Marcus was in the shower, and Sarah was in the kitchen, still in her robe, staring blankly at a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. "Morning, sweetheart," I said, kissing her cheek. "How are you feeling?" Sarah looked up at me with eyes that seemed older than they had just weeks ago. "Tired, Mom. Just really tired." I sat down across from her, studying her face. She'd lost weight since moving in with me, and there were lines of stress around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Marcus's manipulation was taking a visible toll on her physical health. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" She nodded, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug like she was trying to warm herself. "Are you happy?" The question seemed to surprise her. "Happy? What do you mean? I mean, are you happy? Here now, with how things are going in your life?" Sarah looked toward the stairs, where we could hear Marcus moving around in the bedroom. "I'm grateful," she said carefully. "Marcus has been so patient with our financial situation, and you've been so generous letting us stay here. I know I should be grateful." "That's not what I asked. I asked if you're happy." For a moment, Sarah's careful composure cracked, and I saw the exhausted, confused young woman underneath the performance she'd been maintaining. "I don't know," she whispered. "I feel like I don't know anything anymore. Marcus says I'm too emotional, that I overthink everything. He says I should trust him to handle the big decisions because he's better at seeing the whole picture. And what do you think?" "I think," Sarah started, then stopped, glancing toward the stairs again. "I think I used to know what I thought. But now, I'm not sure about anything. That's when I knew that Marcus's manipulation had progressed further than I'd realized. He wasn't just controlling Sarah's environment and decisions. He was systematically destroying her confidence in her own judgment, making her dependent on his interpretation of reality. "Sarah," I said gently, "do you remember when you were little and you used to help me in the garden? You had such strong opinions about where every flower should go, what colors worked together, how to arrange everything so it looked perfect." A small smile crossed her face. "You always said I had an artist's eye for composition." "You did. You still do. You've always been good at seeing how things fit together, at understanding what's really happening in a situation. That hasn't changed just because you're going through a difficult time." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But Marcus says a lot of things," I interrupted softly. "But you don't have to believe everything someone tells you about yourself, even if you love them." We sat in silence for a moment, and I could see Sarah processing what I'd said, trying to reconcile it with the version of herself that Marcus had been promoting. "Mom," she said finally, "do you think I made a mistake, moving in here, bringing Marcus into your life?" It was the first time in months that Sarah had asked for my opinion on anything important, and I knew I had to be careful with my answer. If I attacked Marcus directly, she'd retreat back into defending him. But if I could help her start questioning his narrative, she might begin to see the truth on her own. "I think you made the best decision you could with the information you had at the time," I said. "And I think you're smart enough to recognize when a situation isn't working anymore. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm just being emotional like Marcus says?" "Sarah, trusting your instincts isn't being emotional. It's being intelligent. You know more about your own life than anyone else does, including Marcus." Before Sarah could respond, we heard Marcus coming down the stairs. She immediately straightened up, wiping her eyes and putting on the bright smile she wore whenever he was around. "Good morning, beautiful," Marcus said, kissing the top of her head and squeezing her shoulders. "How's my girl today?" "Good," Sarah said automatically. "Just having coffee with Mom." Marcus looked at me with sharp eyes, as if he could sense that something had shifted in the conversation he'd missed. "Well, I hope you're not filling Sarah's head with worries," he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "She has enough stress without taking on unnecessary concerns." "We were just talking about gardening," I said pleasantly. Sarah was remembering how much she used to enjoy planning the flower beds. "Gardening," Marcus repeated, dismissing the topic with obvious disinterest. "Well, Sarah, we need to discuss some practical matters. Why don't you and I take a walk after breakfast? Get some fresh air and talk about our next steps." Our next steps. I wondered if those next steps involved the accelerated timeline Marcus had discussed with Jerry. "Actually," I said, standing up and moving toward the sink, "I was hoping to spend some time with Sarah today. I've been feeling a bit isolated lately, and I'd love to have some mother-daughter time." Marcus's smile tightened. "That's sweet, Alma, but Sarah and I have some important planning to do. Maybe you could find something else to occupy your time today." "Of course," I said agreeably. "I understand that you have important things to discuss. I'll just work on some projects around the house." Projects around the house. Like recording every word of Marcus's important planning session, and documenting his continued attempts to isolate Sarah from anyone who might encourage her to think independently. Marcus and Sarah left for their walk 20 minutes later, and I immediately retrieved my recorder and tested it to make sure it was working properly. Then I positioned myself in the living room with a book and waited for them to return. When they came back an hour later, Sarah looked even more tense than when they'd left, and Marcus had the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully completed a difficult negotiation. "Mom," Sarah said hesitantly, "Marcus and I have been talking about some changes that might be necessary." I looked up from my book with an expression of polite interest, though my heart was racing. "What kind of changes, sweetheart?" Marcus settled into what had become his chair, positioning himself slightly behind Sarah in a way that let him monitor her facial expressions while she spoke. "Well," Sarah said, glancing back at him for encouragement, "we've been thinking about long-term solutions for everyone's living situation, and Marcus has some ideas that might work better for all of us." "I'm listening," I said calmly. Marcus leaned forward, taking control of the conversation. Alma, we've been observing some concerning changes in your behavior lately. The difficulty adapting to new living arrangements, the resistance to reasonable suggestions, the tendency to focus on past grievances rather than future solutions. Concerning changes. Resistance to reasonable suggestions. Marcus was building his case for my incompetence, using my refusal to accept his takeover as evidence of cognitive decline. What Marcus is saying, Sarah added quickly, is that we're worried about you living independently long term. Even here, in your own house, there are safety concerns. What kind of safety concerns? I asked. Marcus pulled out a folder that he'd apparently prepared for this conversation. Forgetting to lock doors at night. Leaving appliances on. Confusion about medications. Small things, but they add up to a pattern that suggests you might benefit from more structured supervision. Every item on his list was a lie, but they were the kind of lies that would be difficult to disprove without witnesses. And Marcus had made sure I had no witnesses to my actual behavior. The thing is, Mom, Sarah said, her voice getting higher with stress, there are some really nice assisted living facilities in the area. Places where you'd have your own apartment but also have medical staff available if you need help. Assisted living. Right on schedule. It would give you more security, Marcus added. And it would give Sarah and me the space we need to start building our own family. Have you looked at any specific places? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Sarah brightened, apparently relieved that I wasn't arguing. Marcus found this beautiful place called Serenity Gardens. It's only 20 minutes away, and they have a wonderful activities program. When would this transition happen? I asked. Marcus and Sarah exchanged a look, and I could see him nodding slightly. Soon, Sarah said. The waiting list for good facilities can be long, so Marcus thinks we should get your name on the list right away. Just to keep our options open. And in the meantime? In the meantime, Marcus said smoothly, we'd need to start making some practical arrangements. Organizing your paperwork. Consolidating your finances. Making sure everything is set up so the transition goes smoothly when the time comes. Consolidating my finances. Organizing my paperwork. Marcus was moving faster than he'd originally planned, probably because he sensed that Sarah was starting to question his narrative. That makes sense, I said agreeably. I suppose I should gather my important documents so we can review them together. Marcus's eyes lit up with satisfaction. That would be very helpful. Bank statements, insurance policies, property deeds, investment accounts. We'll want to make sure everything is in order. Of course, I said. I'll start working on that this afternoon. After Sarah and Marcus left to visit Serenity Gardens, I sat in my servants' quarters with my recorder and my notebook, planning my next move. Marcus thought he'd successfully convinced me to cooperate with my own victimization, but what he'd actually done was provide me with clear evidence of his fraudulent intentions. I had recorded statements proving he was planning to claim I was incompetent, steal my property, and commit me to a facility against my will. I had documentation of his professional con artist background. And now I had his timeline for executing the fraud. It was time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. I called Janet and scheduled an emergency meeting for the next morning. Then I called the police department and asked to speak to someone about elder fraud prevention. Finally, I called the state attorney general's office and reported suspected elder abuse. Marcus thought he was hunting a helpless old woman, but what he'd actually done was corner a woman who'd spent 74 years learning how to survive, how to fight, and how to win. And tomorrow, he was going to find out exactly what kind of woman he'd been underestimating. The next morning, I sat across from Janet in her office with a folder containing 3 weeks' worth of documentation, audio recordings, and photographs that painted a complete picture of Marcus's criminal operation. Janet listened to the recordings with a grim expression that grew darker with each revelation, taking notes and occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. Alma, this is extensive fraud, she said when I finished presenting the evidence. Elder abuse, property theft conspiracy, document forgery, medical fraud. Marcus isn't just stealing from you, he's running a sophisticated criminal enterprise. I leaned back in my chair, feeling simultaneously vindicated and exhausted. So what do we do with this information? We turn it over to law enforcement immediately. But first, we need to protect you and your assets from any moves Marcus might make while the investigation is ongoing. Janet pulled out a legal pad and started making a list. Emergency restraining order to prevent him from accessing your accounts or claiming any authority over your healthcare decisions. Temporary injunction to prevent any property transfers. And we need to alert the bank and your insurance company that someone may attempt to forge documents in your name. What about Sarah? She doesn't know what Marcus really is. When this all comes out, she's going to be devastated. Sarah is going to need support, not prosecution. Based on your recordings, it's clear she's been systematically manipulated and isolated. The district attorney will likely treat her as a victim rather than an accomplice. Janet made several phone calls while I sat in her office, setting legal protections in motion and scheduling meetings with the fraud unit at the police department. Within 2 hours, I had paperwork that would prevent Marcus from stealing my property, even if he somehow managed to forge power of attorney documents. Now comes the difficult part, Janet said. You need to go home and act normal while law enforcement builds their case. Don't let Marcus know that you're aware of his plans. Let him think his manipulation is working. How long will that take? Probably a few days to a week. They'll want to monitor his communications, possibly set up surveillance, maybe even arrange a controlled situation where he incriminates himself further. I thought about spending another week living in the servants' quarters, watching Marcus manipulate my daughter while pretending to be oblivious to his criminal intentions. I don't know if I can do this much longer, Janet. Watching him destroy Sarah's sense of reality, listening to him plan to steal my life's work. You've been incredibly strong so far. Just a little longer, and then we'll have everything we need to put him away and protect other potential victims. Other potential victims. That phrase stayed with me as I drove home, thinking about the women Marcus had already destroyed, and the ones he might target next if I didn't stop him. I wasn't just fighting for my own property and dignity anymore. I was fighting to prevent Marcus from finding his next elderly victim. When I got home, Marcus and Sarah were in the kitchen with a stack of brochures spread across the table. Sarah looked up when I walked in, her face brightening with forced cheerfulness. Mom, you're back! We've been looking at the materials from Serenity Gardens. It really does look lovely. The brochures showed smiling elderly people engaged in crafts and social activities, with headlines about active senior living and peace of mind for families. It was exactly the kind of marketing that made families feel good about warehousing their elderly relatives. It does look nice, I said, sitting down to examine the brochures. Very organized and clean. Marcus was watching my reaction carefully, probably looking for signs of resistance or suspicion. The best part is the medical staff on site 24 hours a day. You'd never have to worry about emergencies or medication management. Medication management? I wondered if Marcus planned to have me over-medicated to make me more compliant, the way some unscrupulous facilities control difficult residents. When could I visit? I asked. I'd like to see it in person before making any decisions. Actually, Marcus said, I've already scheduled a tour for tomorrow afternoon. I thought it would be better if Sarah and I looked at it first, to make sure it meets our standards, before putting you through the stress of an evaluation. An evaluation. Marcus was planning to have me assessed by someone at the facility, probably someone he'd already bribed or convinced to support his incompetency claims. That's very thoughtful, I said, but I'd really prefer to see it myself. This is a big decision, and I want to be fully informed. Sarah looked uncomfortable. Mom, Marcus thinks it might be overwhelming for you. These facilities have specific procedures for evaluating potential residents, and it can be stressful if you're not prepared. I appreciate the concern, but I'm quite capable of handling a tour of a senior living facility. I've been managing my own affairs for 74 years. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course you're capable, Alma. I'm just trying to streamline the process so it's less taxing for everyone involved. I understand, but I insist on seeing it personally. After all, I'm the one who would be living there. For a moment, Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but then he smiled and nodded. You're absolutely right. Family involvement is important in these decisions. I'll call and arrange for all three of us to tour together. I spent that afternoon in my servants' quarters, organizing the documents Marcus had requested, while actually preparing copies of everything for Janet and the police. My real financial records were already secured in Janet's office, but I created a set of convincing forgeries that would give Marcus just enough information to hang himself with, while protecting my actual assets. I also used the time to call my bank and my insurance company, alerting them to watch for any fraudulent activity and requiring in-person verification for any major transactions. If Marcus tried to move forward with his theft before the authorities were ready, he'd find every door locked and every account protected. Around 4 o'clock, I heard Marcus on the phone again, and I slipped closer to the wall to listen with my recorder running. Jerry, we're moving to the final phase tomorrow. I've got her agreeing to tour the facility, and once they do their evaluation, we'll have the medical documentation we need for the incompetency filing. There was a pause while Jerry responded. No, she won't be a problem. She's completely bought into the concerned family narrative. She actually thinks this is about her safety and well-being, instead of property transfer. Another pause. The daughter's getting a little jumpy, asking more questions than I'd like. But she's still following my lead on the major decisions. Once we get the mother committed, Sarah will be so grateful for my handling of the crisis that she'll sign whatever I put in front of her. The timeline's tight but doable. Facility evaluation tomorrow, medical certification by Friday, power of attorney filing next Monday. We should have full financial control within 10 days. 10 days. Marcus was planning to have complete control of my assets within 10 days. Jerry, relax. I've done this 4 times before. The key is keeping everyone focused on the emotional aspects instead of the legal details. These families never think to get independent legal advice until it's too late. 4 times before. Marcus had successfully stolen from 4 other elderly women using the same pattern. 4 other families destroyed, 4 other daughters left to discover they'd been manipulated into betraying their own mothers. The property assessment came back at $790. After legal fees and facility costs, we're looking at a net profit of around $600,000, split 4 ways. That's $150 each, minus expenses. Split 4 ways. Marcus had 3 accomplices helping him steal from elderly women. Jerry, the corrupt doctor who provided false medical testimony, and presumably someone at Serenity Gardens who facilitated the fraudulent evaluations. Once this is wrapped up, we'll let things cool down for a few months before identifying the next target. I've already got my eye on a situation in Riverside that looks promising. The next target. Marcus was already planning his next victim before he'd finished destroying me. I turned off the recorder and sat on my narrow bed, staring at the brick wall outside my window. In 10 days, if I hadn't stopped him, Marcus would have stolen my house, committed me to a facility against my will, and moved on to destroy another family. Sarah would be left with the devastating realization that the man she'd trusted had used her to steal from her own mother. But Marcus had made one critical error in his planning. He'd assumed I was a typical elderly victim, isolated and vulnerable, without the resources or knowledge to fight back. He had no idea that I'd been documenting his every move, that I'd already secured legal protection for my assets, and that law enforcement was building a case against his entire operation. Tomorrow's facility tour wasn't going to be his opportunity to have me declared incompetent. It was going to be his confession to the authorities, who would be monitoring every word. That evening, Sarah knocked on my door with a dinner tray, something she'd started doing since I'd moved to the servants' quarters. It was a small kindness that reminded me of the thoughtful daughter I'd raised, buried somewhere under Marcus's psychological manipulation. Mom, can I come in for a minute? I opened the door wider and gestured to the single chair that barely fit in the tiny room. Sarah sat down while I perched on the edge of the bed, and for a moment we just looked at each other. Sarah, are you okay? You look tired. She rubbed her eyes, and I could see how much weight she'd lost, how thin and strained she'd become. I'm fine. just stressed about everything. The job search, the money situation, worrying about you. What worries you about me? Sarah hesitated, and I could see her struggling with something she wasn't sure how to express. Marcus says you're having some cognitive issues, but you seem fine to me. You seem like yourself. What kind of cognitive issues does Marcus think I'm having? Confusion about finances, difficulty adapting to changes, some paranoid thinking about people trying to take advantage of you. Sarah paused. But Mom, you've been managing your own money for decades. You adapted to living alone after Dad died. And given what's happening with the housing situation, being worried about people taking advantage doesn't seem paranoid. This was the first time in months that Sarah had questioned Marcus's narrative about my mental state, and I could see her beginning to trust her own observations over his interpretations. Sarah, what do you think about the assisted living idea? Honestly? She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring. I think it's happening very fast. A month ago, Marcus was talking about us all living here together long term. Now suddenly there's urgency about getting you into a facility. What changed? I don't know. Marcus says he's been noticing things gradually, but it feels sudden to me. And the timing seems convenient right when we're having financial problems and you're the only one with resources to help. Sarah was starting to see the pattern, starting to question the narrative Marcus had been feeding her. I wanted to tell her everything, to show her the recordings and the evidence of Marcus's criminal plans. But Jana had been clear that I needed to let law enforcement handle the revelation to ensure Marcus couldn't destroy evidence or flee. Sarah, can I ask you to do something for me? Of course. At the facility tour tomorrow, I want you to pay attention to your own instincts. Don't worry about what Marcus thinks you should observe. Just watch and listen and trust your own judgment about what you see. Why? Because you're smart and perceptive. And your opinion matters to me. Whatever decisions we make should be based on what's actually best for our family, not what's convenient for other people. Sarah studied my face, and I could see her processing what I'd said. Mom, are you worried about something specific? I wanted to tell her that I was worried about the man she'd married, worried about his plans to steal from both of us, worried about the network of criminals he worked with, who specialized in destroying families like ours. Instead, I said, I'm worried about making irreversible decisions without having all the information we need. Sarah nodded slowly. That makes sense. I've been feeling like everything is moving too fast, but Marcus says that's just because change is always uncomfortable. Change can be uncomfortable, I agreed. But that doesn't mean we should stop thinking critically about the choices we're making. After Sarah left, I lay in my narrow bed listening to the sounds of my house around me. Marcus and Sarah were moving around upstairs, getting ready for bed in my bedroom, using my bathroom, sleeping in the space where Victor and I had shared 30 years of marriage. But tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, Marcus would walk into what he thought was the final phase of his con game, and instead find himself face to face with the law enforcement officers who'd been building a case against him. I thought about the 4 other women he'd victimized, the families he'd destroyed, the lives he'd ruined in pursuit of easy money. Tomorrow, his criminal career would end, and no other elderly woman would find herself trapped in servants' quarters in her own home, while her predator planned to steal her life's work. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, which seemed appropriate for what Marcus probably thought would be my last day of independent living. I dressed carefully in my most respectable outfit, wanting to look competent and alert for whatever evaluation Marcus had arranged at Serenity Gardens. Over breakfast, Marcus outlined his plan for the day with the confidence of someone who believed he was in complete control of the situation. We'll tour the facility first, meet with the intake coordinator, and then you'll have a brief evaluation with their medical staff. Nothing invasive, just some basic questions about your health and daily living skills. What kind of questions? I asked. Standard stuff. Memory, orientation, ability to manage medications and finances. They want to make sure you'd be appropriate for their level of care. I nodded agreeably while thinking about the recorder in my purse that would capture every word of this fraudulent evaluation. Will Sarah be with me during the evaluation? Actually, they prefer to conduct initial assessments privately, to avoid family influence on the responses. Sarah and I will be meeting with the financial coordinator during that time. Of course they would. Marcus needed Sarah distracted while he arranged for my false diagnosis, and he probably wanted to start the paperwork for transferring my assets to pay for the facility costs. That sounds efficient, I said. I appreciate you handling all the logistics. Marcus smiled with satisfaction. That's what family is for, Alma. Taking care of each other when life gets complicated. At 10:30, we drove to Serenity Gardens in Marcus's car, with me in the back seat like a child being taken to an appointment she couldn't manage herself. The facility was exactly what I'd expected. A sprawling complex designed to look home-like, but with the institutional feel that came from housing hundreds of people in identical units. The lobby was decorated with artificial flowers and motivational posters about aging gracefully. Soft music played from hidden speakers, and the air smelled of industrial disinfectant barely masked by vanilla air freshener. Elderly residents sat in chairs arranged around a television, staring blankly at a morning talk show. Our tour guide was a woman named Patricia, who spoke in the overly cheerful tone healthcare workers used when talking to people they considered mentally compromised. She showed us a sample apartment, explained the meal schedule, and described the activities program with enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. "And what about medical care?" Marcus asked. "Mrs. Henderson has been having some memory issues lately, and we want to make sure she'd receive appropriate supervision." "Oh, we have extensive experience with cognitive decline," Patricia said, giving me a sympathetic look. "Our medical staff specializes in managing residents with various stages of dementia and confusion." Stages of dementia and confusion. I wasn't showing any signs of either condition, but Patricia was already discussing me as if my cognitive impairment was an established fact. "How do you assess new residents?" Sarah asked, and I could hear the genuine concern in her voice. "We have a comprehensive evaluation process," Patricia explained. "Medical history review, cognitive assessment, daily living skills evaluation. Dr. Reeves conducts all our intake assessments personally." Dr. Reeves. I wondered if this was the corrupt doctor Marcus had mentioned in his phone conversations. The one who would provide false testimony about my mental state. "When could Mrs. Henderson have her evaluation?" Marcus asked. "Actually, Dr. Reeves is available right now if you'd like to get that completed today. It would save you another trip." Right now. Marcus's urgency was showing, and I could see Sarah noticing the push to move faster than she was comfortable with. "That would be convenient," I said agreeably. "I'm ready whenever Dr. Reeves is." Patricia led us to a small office where a thin man in a white coat was waiting with a clipboard and what appeared to be a standard mental status examination. Dr. Reeves looked exactly like what I'd expected, someone whose medical license was probably hanging by a thread, and who supplemented his income by providing fraudulent evaluations for Marcus's criminal operation. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Reeves said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I understand you're considering joining our community here at Serenity Gardens." "That's right," I said, settling into the chair and placing my purse where the recorder inside could capture the conversation clearly. "And your family has expressed some concerns about your ability to live independently?" I glanced toward the door where Marcus and Sarah had disappeared with the financial coordinator. "Yes, they're worried about my safety." Dr. Reeves made a note on his clipboard. "Can you tell me what year it is?" 2024. "And who is the current president?" I answered correctly, as I did for all his basic orientation questions. Dr. Reeves seemed slightly surprised by my competent responses. But he continued with more complex questions about memory, reasoning, and daily living skills. Every answer I gave was clear, accurate, and demonstrated full cognitive function. But I could see Dr. Reeves making notes that probably didn't reflect my actual responses, preparing to write a report that would support Marcus's incompetency claims, regardless of my performance. "Mrs. Henderson, your family mentioned that you've been having some confusion about financial matters. Can you tell me about your experience managing money?" "I've managed my own finances for over 50 years, I said. "I balanced checkbooks before computers, invested in retirement funds, and paid off my mortgage early. I've never had any problems understanding or managing money." Dr. Reeves made another note that probably recorded the opposite of what I'd just told him. "And how do you feel about the possibility of moving to assisted living?" This was my opportunity to catch him in his fraud. "Doctor, I'm curious about the medical basis for recommending assisted living." What specific cognitive or physical impairments have you observed that would make independent living unsafe for me? Dr. Reeves looked uncomfortable with the direct question. Well, your family reports concerning behaviors that suggest possible cognitive decline. What specific behaviors? Confusion about living arrangements, difficulty adapting to changes, some paranoid thinking about financial exploitation. Doctor, moving to a smaller room when family members need space isn't confusion, it's accommodation. Being cautious about financial decisions isn't paranoid thinking, it's prudent money management. Are you diagnosing cognitive impairment based on family reports rather than clinical observation? Dr. Reeves's discomfort was now obvious. He'd expected a confused elderly woman who would provide him with responses he could twist into evidence of incompetency. Instead, he was facing someone who understood exactly what he was trying to do, and was forcing him to either conduct a legitimate evaluation or reveal his fraudulent intentions. Mrs. Henderson, I'm just trying to understand your current level of functioning to determine the most appropriate care setting. Based on your clinical observation during this evaluation, what evidence of cognitive impairment have you documented? Dr. Reeves stared at his clipboard, where his notes probably showed a completely competent woman who was asking questions he couldn't answer honestly. Well, the evaluation isn't complete yet. I'll need to review all the information before making any recommendations. Of course, I said pleasantly. I'm sure you'll want to base your medical opinion on actual clinical findings rather than second-hand reports from family members with potential financial interests in the outcome. I could see the moment drive. Reeves realized that I knew exactly what kind of evaluation this was supposed to be, and that I was documenting his every word for potential legal proceedings. Let me get your family so we can discuss the next steps, he said, standing up quickly and practically fleeing from the room. I sat alone for a few minutes, knowing that Dr. Reeves was probably having a frantic conversation with Marcus about the unexpected problem of an alert, competent patient who was asking uncomfortable questions about the fraudulent evaluation process. When Marcus and Sarah returned, Marcus's face was tight with barely controlled anger. How did the evaluation go, Mom? Very well, I said cheerfully. Dr. Reeves was very thorough. I'm sure his report will accurately reflect my cognitive function and ability to live independently. Marcus looked like he wanted to strangle me, but he managed to maintain his concerned family member facade. Well, we'll wait to hear Dr. Reeves's recommendations before making any decisions. As we drove home, I could feel the tension radiating from Marcus like heat from an oven. His carefully planned timeline was falling apart, and he was probably trying to figure out how to salvage his scheme now that his medical accomplice had failed to provide the fraudulent diagnosis he needed. But Marcus didn't know that his problems were just beginning. While he'd been trying to have me declared incompetent, law enforcement had been monitoring his communications and building a case that would destroy his entire criminal operation. Tonight, Marcus would probably make desperate phone calls to Jerry and his other accomplices, trying to figure out a new approach to stealing my property. And tomorrow, when he thought he was executing his backup plan, he'd find himself in handcuffs instead. I spent that evening in my servants' quarters, listening to Marcus pace in my bedroom above, while he made increasingly frantic phone calls to his criminal partners. Every word was being recorded, every conversation was providing more evidence for the prosecution, and every hour that passed brought him closer to the justice he'd avoided for too long. 4 families had been destroyed by Marcus's greed. Tomorrow, the 5th family would be the one that brought him down. The morning Marcus's world collapsed started like any other day, with him drinking coffee in my kitchen while planning my destruction. I was washing dishes at the sink, invisible in the way he'd trained himself to see me, when Detective Rodriguez and Detective Chen knocked on my front door at exactly 9:15. Marcus opened the door with his usual confident smile, probably expecting to see a delivery or maybe someone looking for directions. Instead, he found 2 plainclothes officers with badges and a warrant that would unravel 3 years of carefully orchestrated theft. Marcus Wilhelm? Detective Rodriguez asked, though his tone made it clear this wasn't really a question. Yes, that's me. Can I help you with something? We're with the County Fraud Unit. We have some questions about your involvement with elderly financial exploitation and medical fraud. May we come in? I watched Marcus's face cycle through confusion, concern, and calculation in the space of about 3 seconds. His smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes, the same cold assessment I'd seen when he first started planning to move me to the servants' quarters. "I'm not sure what this is about," Marcus said, stepping back to let them enter. "But of course, whatever I can do to help." Detective Chen was scanning the living room, taking in the expensive furniture Marcus had rearranged, and the architectural drawings he'd left spread across my dining room table. "Is this your residence, Mr. Wilhelm?" "I'm staying here with my wife and her mother temporarily. We're helping with some family care issues." Family care issues. Even facing police questioning, Marcus couldn't resist framing his criminal activity as concern for my welfare. "And where is Mrs. Henderson now?" Marcus gestured toward the kitchen, where I was still standing at the sink, hands dripping soapy water onto the floor. "She's right there. Alma, these officers have some questions about, well, I'm not sure what about." Detective Rodriguez looked at me with the kind of careful attention that made it clear this wasn't a surprise visit. "Mrs. Henderson, we'd like to speak with you privately, if that's possible." "Of course," I said, drying my hands on a dish towel. "We could use the living room." "Actually," Detective Chen said, "we'd prefer to speak somewhere more private. Is there somewhere we could go without being overheard?" I led them to the servants' quarters, the tiny room that had become my prison for the past month. Both detectives had to duck slightly to fit through the doorway, and Detective Rodriguez whistled low when he saw the cramped space with its single bed and view of the brick wall. "This is where you've been living?" Detective Chen asked. "For the past several weeks, yes. Marcus felt it would be better for everyone if I moved down here." "And how do you feel about this arrangement?" I sat on the edge of the narrow bed while both detectives remained standing in the space that barely fit 3 people. "I feel like I've been systematically isolated and degraded in my own home by a man who's planning to steal my property and commit me to a facility against my will." Detective Rodriguez pulled out a digital recorder. "Mrs. Henderson, we've been investigating Marcus Wilhelm and his associates for several months. We understand you have information that might be relevant to our case." "I have extensive documentation," I said, reaching for the folder I'd prepared. "Audio recordings, financial records, written threats, evidence of his criminal network, and proof of his plan to forge medical documents and claim fraudulent power of attorney." I handed over copies of everything I'd gathered, watching both detectives' expressions grow more serious as they reviewed the evidence I'd collected during my weeks in exile. "This is comprehensive," Detective Chen said, looking through the audio transcripts. "You've documented multiple felonies here. Elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, forgery, and medical fraud." "Marcus has done this before," I said. "At least 4 other elderly women have been victimized by his operation. He targets families through the adult children, manipulates the family dynamics, then steals the elderly person's assets, while having them committed to facilities." Detective Rodriguez was studying the architectural drawings I'd photographed. "These show renovations to your property. Was he planning to sell your house?" According to his phone conversations with his accomplice Jerry, he was planning to flip it for a profit of around $600,000. Split 4 ways between his criminal network. "Jerry Hawkins," Detective Chen said, consulting his notes. "We've been tracking him for 2 years. He's the one who arranges the corrupt medical evaluations and forged documents." "And Dr. Reeves at Serenity Gardens?" "Dr. Reeves has been providing false diagnoses for incompetency proceedings in exchange for payments from Wilhelm's operation. We have records of at least 12 fraudulent evaluations over the past 3 years. 12 fraudulent evaluations. 12 families destroyed by Marcus's greed, and Dr. Reeves's willingness to sell his medical license to the highest bidder." "What about Sarah?" I asked. "My daughter doesn't know what Marcus really is. She's been manipulated and isolated just as much as I have." "We understand that Mrs. Wilhelm is also a victim here," Detective Rodriguez said gently. "Our investigation shows that she's been psychologically manipulated and financially controlled." We're not treating her as a suspect. Relief washed over me so intensely that I had to grip the edge of the bed to steady myself. Sarah would be devastated when she learned the truth about Marcus, but at least she wouldn't be facing criminal charges for his crimes. What happens now? I asked. Now we arrest Marcus Wilhelm and his accomplices, Detective Chen said. We have enough evidence to charge him with multiple felonies, and your documentation provides corroborating evidence for several other cases we've been building. Will I have to testify? Probably, but not for a while. First, we'll process the arrests and see if Wilhelm wants to cooperate with our investigation of the larger network. Your testimony will be crucial for prosecution, but we'll prepare you thoroughly for that process. Detective Rodriguez stood up, his head nearly touching the slanted ceiling of the servants' quarters. Mrs. Henderson, would you like to be present when we arrest him? You don't have to be, but some victims find it helpful to see the moment when their abuser loses control. I thought about Marcus upstairs in my kitchen, probably growing more nervous with each minute the detective spent talking to me. He was likely trying to figure out what I might be telling them, whether I'd figured out his plans, how much trouble he was actually in. Yes, I said. I'd like to be there. We walked back upstairs together, and I could see Marcus pacing in the living room while Sarah sat on the couch looking confused and frightened. She jumped up when she saw me with the detectives. Mom, what's going on? Marcus said they're investigating some kind of financial fraud, but I don't understand what that has to do with us. I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised who'd been so thoroughly manipulated that she couldn't see the criminal sitting in her mother's living room. Sarah, there are some things about Marcus that you don't know, things he's been hiding from both of us. Marcus moved quickly to Sarah's side, putting his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that looked protective, but was actually possessive. Ella, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. These officers seem to think I'm involved in something I'm not. Detective Chen stepped forward with handcuffs already in his hand. Marcus Wilhelm, you're under arrest for elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and theft by deception. The change in Marcus was immediate and stunning. The mask of concerned family member dropped completely, replaced by something cold and calculating, and entirely without remorse. He looked at me with naked hatred, no longer bothering to pretend he cared about my welfare. You stupid old bitch, he snarled. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know how many people you're going to hurt with this vindictive bullshit? Sarah gasped and stepped back from him, seeing for the first time the real Marcus underneath the performance he'd been maintaining for months. Marcus, what are they talking about? What financial fraud? What conspiracy? Detective Rodriguez was reading Marcus his rights while Detective Chen secured the handcuffs. But Marcus kept talking, his voice rising with rage and desperation. Sarah, don't listen to them. Your mother is having some kind of paranoid episode. She's been imagining conspiracies and threats that don't exist. This is exactly the kind of thing that proves she needs professional medical supervision. Even being arrested, even facing multiple felony charges, Marcus was still trying to manipulate the situation, still trying to convince Sarah that I was the problem. But Sarah was staring at him with growing recognition, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Marcus, how do they know about financial fraud? Why are they arresting you specifically? Because he's a professional con artist, Detective Chen said bluntly. He targets elderly women by manipulating their adult children, then steals their property while having them committed to facilities. Your mother is his fifth known victim. Fifth known victim. Sarah's face went white as the implications hit her. Marcus, is this true? Marcus looked at her with contempt, no longer bothering to maintain his loving husband facade. Sarah, you were never supposed to figure it out. You were supposed to be grateful for everything I handled for you, including dealing with your increasingly difficult mother. Dealing with my mother? Marcus, what did you do? I solved your problems, he said coldly. Your mother was sitting on nearly $800,000 in property value, while you struggled to find work and pay bills. I arranged a situation that would have given us access to those resources while providing appropriate care for an elderly woman who clearly couldn't manage her own affairs. You were stealing from my mother? I was optimizing underutilized assets for the benefit of the family. Sarah looked like she'd been slapped. The servants' quarters. You made her live in the servants' quarters while planning to steal her house? I made practical decisions about living arrangements while addressing her declining cognitive abilities. Detective Rodriguez had finished the arrest process and was preparing to lead Marcus out of the house. Mr. Wilhelm, you'll have the opportunity to explain your perspective to a judge. Right now, you need to come with us. As they walked Marcus toward the door, he turned back to look at Sarah with something that might have been regret, if it hadn't been so obviously calculated. Sarah, when you realize how much money you're giving up because of your mother's paranoia, remember that I tried to secure our future. I tried to give us a life that matched what we deserved. Then he looked at me, and his expression was pure venom. Enjoy your servants' quarters, Alma. Enjoy living alone in this museum, while your daughter figures out how to survive, without the security I could have provided. After the police car pulled away, Sarah and I stood in the living room that Marcus had rearranged, surrounded by his architectural drawings and renovation plans for my house. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of everything that had been revealed in the past hour. Mom, Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. How long have you known? I started suspecting something was wrong about 2 weeks after you moved in. I started documenting everything 3 weeks ago. I confirmed he was a professional criminal about a week ago. And you didn't tell me? I sat down in my chair, the one Marcus had moved to the least desirable spot in the room, and looked at my daughter, who seemed to have aged years in the past hour. Sarah, he had you so isolated and confused that you couldn't trust your own perceptions. If I'd told you Marcus was a criminal, what would you have done? Sarah thought about it, and I could see her remembering the past few months, remembering how quickly she'd started deferring to Marcus's judgment about everything. I would have defended him, she said quietly. I would have thought you were being paranoid or jealous or trying to break us up. Marcus is very good at what he does. He's had years of practice manipulating families and turning children against their parents. You're not stupid for falling for it, Sarah. You're human. Sarah collapsed onto the couch, putting her head in her hands. God, Mom, the things I let him do to you, the servants' quarters, the way I talked to you about assisted living, the way I just accepted his version of everything. You are being manipulated by a professional criminal who specializes in psychological control. The FBI probably has profiles on his methods. But I should have seen it. I should have protected you instead of helping him hurt you. I got up from my chair and sat next to Sarah on the couch, putting my arm around her shoulders the way I used to when she was small and had nightmares. Sarah, Marcus spent months convincing you that I was becoming incompetent, that my judgment couldn't be trusted, that he was the expert on what was best for everyone. He isolated you from your friends, made you financially dependent on his planning, and gradually trained you to see everything through his perspective. That's not something you should have recognized. That's something he designed specifically to be unrecognizable. How many other women did he do this to? At least 4 that the police know about. Probably more. Sarah started crying then, deep sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. Mom, I helped him try to steal your house. I helped him convince you to move to the servants' quarters. I was going to help him put you in assisted living against your will. You were going to help someone you trusted do what you thought was best for your family. The fact that he was lying about his intentions doesn't make you responsible for his crimes. But what if you hadn't figured it out? What if he'd succeeded? I thought about that alternative timeline, the one where Marcus had successfully manipulated us both into giving him control of my property. Sarah finding out too late that the man she'd trusted had stolen from her own mother. Me dying in some facility while Marcus lived in my house and spent my money. But he didn't succeed, I said. We figured it out in time, and now he's going to face consequences for what he's done. And hopefully, we prevented him from finding his next victim. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked around the living room with its rearranged furniture and Marcus's personal belongings scattered everywhere. What do we do now? Now we put the house back the way it was. I move out of the servants' quarters and back into my bedroom. You decide whether you want to stay here while you get back on your feet, or whether you'd prefer to start fresh somewhere else. Do you want me to stay? I looked at my daughter, this woman who'd been so systematically manipulated that she'd lost sight of her own judgment and values. The daughter I'd raised was still there, underneath the confusion and psychological damage Marcus had inflicted. Sarah, I want you to stay as long as you need to heal from what Marcus did to you. I want you to remember who you are when you're not being controlled by someone who specializes in destroying women's confidence. And I want you to help me make sure Marcus goes to prison for a very long time. That afternoon, we started the process of reclaiming my house from Marcus's occupation. Sarah helped me move my belongings back to my bedroom, and we carried Marcus's things to the garage where they'd wait for someone to pick them up. We put Victor's books back in the study, returned my furniture to its original arrangements, and threw away the architectural drawings that showed Marcus's plans for renovating my property. But the most important thing we did was sit at my kitchen table, the one where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 30 years before Marcus decided I belonged in the servants' quarters, and plan how we were going to rebuild our relationship after months of systematic manipulation designed to turn us against each other. Mom, I need to understand how I got so lost. How did I go from being someone who would never let anyone hurt you to someone who was helping him destroy your dignity? I poured us both coffee from my good machine, the one Marcus had relegated to occasional use while he took over my kitchen. Sarah, Marcus is a professional predator. He studied you for months before you even moved in here, learning your vulnerabilities, your insecurities, your pressure points. Then he systematically exploited all of them while convincing you he was protecting you. What vulnerabilities? Your fear of being a burden, your need to be helpful, your tendency to defer to people you perceive as more knowledgeable about complex situations, your guilt about not being more financially successful. Sarah winced. He knew exactly which buttons to push, and he pushed them constantly, while simultaneously convincing you that I was becoming a burden you needed to manage. He made you feel responsible for solving problems he'd created, then positioned himself as the only person capable of providing solutions. I can't believe I fell for it. Sarah, FBI profilers have written papers about men like Marcus. They choose their victims carefully, and they're very good at what they do. The fact that you eventually started questioning his narrative shows that your instincts were still working, even under all that manipulation. Detective Chen called that evening to let us know that Marcus's arrest had led to the capture of his entire network. Jerry Hawkins had been arrested at his home, Dr. Reeves had been taken into custody at Serenity Gardens, and a fourth accomplice who handled the forged documents had been arrested in another county. The charges are extensive, Detective Chen told me over the phone. Wilhelm alone is facing 12 felony counts, and we expect more charges as we review evidence from other cases. With his prior record and the scope of this operation, he's looking at 15 to 20 years in prison. What about restitution for his other victims? That's more complicated. Wilhelm and his associates spent most of what they stole, and much of it was transferred offshore or hidden in ways that make recovery difficult. But we're working with federal authorities to trace assets and return what we can to the families he victimized. 20 years in prison. It seemed like appropriate justice for a man who'd made a career of destroying elderly women's lives, but I knew it wouldn't undo the damage he'd done to 4 other families. Detective Chen, will the other victims be notified about the arrests? We're reaching out to all the families we can locate. Some of the victims have passed away since Wilhelm stole from them, but their children deserve to know that the man who destroyed their mothers is finally facing consequences. After I hung up, Sarah and I sat in my living room, now restored to its original arrangement, and talked about the future. Not the future Marcus had planned for us, where I'd be warehoused in a facility while he sold my house and spent my money. The real future, where Sarah would heal from his psychological abuse, and I would reclaim the dignity he'd tried to strip away. Mom, I want to do something to help other families avoid what we went through. Is there a way to educate people about these kinds of scams? Detective Chen mentioned that the fraud unit gives presentations to community groups about elder abuse prevention. Maybe we could volunteer to share our story. Would you be comfortable with that? Talking publicly about what Marcus did to us? I thought about the 4 other women who'd lost everything to Marcus's greed, about the families who'd discovered too late that their trust had been weaponized against them, about the next potential victim who might be saved if people understood how these predators operated. Sarah, I spent a month living in servants' quarters in my own house while a criminal planned to steal my life's work. If talking about that experience prevents even one other family from going through what we went through, then yes, I'm comfortable with it. 2 weeks later, Sarah moved back into her old bedroom, the one she'd grown up in, while she applied for jobs and worked with a therapist who specialized in psychological manipulation recovery. I moved back into my master bedroom and reclaimed my morning routine of coffee at the kitchen table while watching the sunrise through the window. But the most important thing we reclaimed was our relationship. Without Marcus's constant manipulation driving wedges between us, Sarah and I remembered how to talk to each other, how to trust each other's judgment, how to be a family that supported rather than exploited its members. Marcus had tried to erase me from my own life, to reduce me to a powerless old woman whose only value was the money he could steal from her. Instead, he'd revealed exactly how strong I was, how resourceful I could be when protecting myself and my family, and how dangerous it was to underestimate a woman who'd spent 74 years learning how to survive. The servants' quarters stood empty now, just a storage room again, but I kept it exactly as it had been during my month of exile. Not as a shrine to my victimization, but as a reminder that I'd survived Marcus's worst efforts to destroy me, and that I'd emerged stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. Sometimes I stood in that tiny room and remembered the woman who'd slept there, the woman who'd felt powerless and isolated while listening to her life being planned around her. Then I'd walk upstairs to my real bedroom, the one with the garden view and the memories of my marriage to Victor, and remember that surviving an attack doesn't just mean enduring it. Sometimes it means fighting back so effectively that your attacker becomes the one who loses everything. Marcus had thought he was hunting a helpless elderly woman. Instead, he'd cornered a woman who knew exactly how to fight back, how to document his crimes, how to bring him down, and how to protect other potential victims from his predatory career. The last I heard, Marcus was serving his 15-year sentence in a state prison, sharing a cell with someone who probably hadn't spent decades perfecting the art of manipulation and control. Dr. Reeves had lost his medical license and was facing his own criminal charges. Jerry Hawkins was cooperating with federal authorities to identify other criminal networks that targeted elderly victims. And I was living in my own house, in my own bedroom, making my own decisions about my own life, while helping law enforcement build cases against other predators who thought elderly women were easy targets. Marcus had been wrong about a lot of things, but his biggest mistake was thinking that age made me vulnerable instead of dangerous. He'd learned too late that a woman who'd survived 74 years had probably learned a few things about dealing with predators. And now, every time I sat at my kitchen table with my morning coffee, I remembered that I'd not only survived his attack, I'd destroyed his criminal career and protected every woman he might have targeted next. That knowledge tasted better than any victory I could have imagined. 6 months after Marcus's arrest, I stood in the conference room at the county courthouse, looking at a table full of documents that represented the culmination of the largest elder fraud investigation in the state's history. Detective Chen had called me in to review evidence for the upcoming federal trial, and what I saw spread across that table took my breath away. Marcus's criminal network had been far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. The investigation had uncovered 17 victims across 3 states, with stolen assets totaling over $4 million. Elderly women from suburban neighborhoods, rural farming communities, and urban retirement complexes had all fallen prey to the same systematic manipulation that Marcus had tried to use on me. "Mrs. Henderson," said Assistant District Attorney Patricia Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd been building the prosecution case, "your documentation was the key that unlocked this entire operation. Without your recordings and evidence gathering, we never would have been able to connect all these cases." I picked up a photograph from the table, showing a woman about my age standing in front of a modest ranch house. Her name was Dorothy Chen, and according to the file, Marcus had convinced her son Michael that she was becoming dangerously forgetful. Within 6 months, Dorothy had been moved to a care facility, while Marcus and his accomplices sold her house and liquidated her retirement savings. She'd died in that facility 8 months later, never understanding why her son had taken everything away from her. "How many of the other victims are still alive?" I asked. 7, Detective Chen replied grimly. "The others passed away either in facilities or in poverty after their assets were stolen. Most of them died thinking their own children had betrayed them." I set down Dorothy's photograph and picked up another file. This one belonged to Margaret Tobin, a retired schoolteacher from a town 60 miles away. Marcus's accomplice had targeted Margaret through her daughter Lisa, convincing her that Margaret was showing signs of dementia and needed immediate intervention. By the time Lisa realized what was happening, Margaret had been declared incompetent, and her property had been transferred to a trust controlled by Marcus's network. Is Margaret still alive? She is, and she's been following your case closely. She asked if she could meet you. I'd like that very much. Ada Morrison pulled out a thick folder marked with my name. Mrs. Henderson, we're going to need you to testify in the federal trial. Your case is unique because you documented the crime while it was happening and successfully prevented the theft. You're our star witness. I thought about standing in a courtroom full of strangers, reliving the humiliation of being forced into servants' quarters in my own home, describing the systematic psychological abuse that Marcus had inflicted on both Sarah and me. It wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. When do you need me? The trial starts in 3 months. We'll spend considerable time preparing your testimony, making sure you're comfortable with the process, and ensuring that Marcus's defense attorneys can't intimidate or confuse you. What kind of defense is Marcus planning? Detective Chen snorted. His lawyers are claiming he was providing legitimate elder care services and that his clients misunderstood the financial arrangements. They're trying to frame this as a civil matter rather than criminal fraud. Legitimate elder care services, I repeated. Is that what they call forcing elderly women into servants' quarters and having them declared mentally incompetent? That's exactly what they call it. Which is why your testimony is so crucial. You can describe their methods from the victim's perspective, while also demonstrating that you were completely competent throughout the entire process. Ada Morrison showed me a timeline that prosecutors had constructed of Marcus's criminal career. It started 7 years ago with his first known victim, a widow named Helen Vasquez, whose daughter Carmen had been struggling financially after a divorce. Marcus had targeted Carmen at a support group for adult children of aging parents, presenting himself as someone who understood the challenges of caring for elderly relatives. Within a year, Helen had been moved to a facility while Marcus sold her house and emptied her investment accounts. Carmen didn't realize she'd been manipulated until after her mother's death, when she tried to access Helen's safety deposit box and discovered it had been cleaned out months earlier. This shows a clear pattern of escalation, Ada Morrison explained. Marcus refined his techniques with each victim, learning what worked and what didn't. By the time he targeted your family, he'd perfected his approach. But he made mistakes with us. He underestimated you. Most of his previous victims were more isolated, had fewer resources, or were already showing signs of cognitive decline. You were alert, financially sophisticated, and suspicious enough to start documenting everything before he could complete his theft. Detective Chen pointed to another section of the timeline. Marcus also got overconfident. In earlier cases, he moved slowly, sometimes taking 2 years to gain complete control. With you, he tried to accelerate the timeline because he was planning to move to another state and start targeting victims there. Another state? We found evidence that he was researching potential victims in Florida and Arizona, areas with large elderly populations and high property values. If you hadn't stopped him, he probably would have relocated and started the process all over again. I spent the rest of that afternoon reviewing case files and preparing for my eventual testimony. Each victim's story followed the same horrible pattern: manipulation of adult children, isolation of elderly parents, systematic theft of assets, and eventual abandonment when the money ran out. Reading through 17 variations of the same crime made me feel simultaneously grateful that I'd escaped, and furious that so many other women hadn't been as fortunate. When I got home that evening, Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner, something she'd started doing as part of her healing process. Cooking gave her a sense of control and accomplishment, and sharing meals had become an important part of rebuilding our relationship. How did the meeting go? She asked, looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. Overwhelming. Marcus victimized at least 17 women that they know about. Stole over $4 million. Some of the victims died thinking their own children had betrayed them. Sarah's knife paused in its chopping motion. 17 women. And I almost helped him make it 18. Sarah, you were a victim too. Marcus targeted you specifically because he identified you as someone he could manipulate into giving him access to me. I know that intellectually. But emotionally, it's still hard to accept that I was so completely fooled. I sat down at the kitchen table, watching my daughter work through her own healing process. Sarah had been in therapy for 5 months, learning to rebuild her confidence and trust her own judgment again. Some days were better than others, but she was making steady progress toward becoming the strong, independent woman I'd raised. Sarah, the prosecutor wants me to testify in the federal trial. I wanted you to know in case you want to be there. Do you want me there? I want whatever would be most helpful for your healing. If watching Marcus face consequences would give you closure, then yes. If it would be too traumatic or set back your progress, then no. Sarah resumed chopping vegetables, considering my question. I think I need to be there. I need to see him held accountable for what he did to all those women. And I need to support you while you testify about what he did to us. That night, I called Margaret Tobin, the retired school teacher who'd asked to meet me. Her voice was strong and clear over the phone, with just a hint of the southern accent she'd probably had her whole life. Mrs. Henderson, I can't tell you how grateful I am that you stopped that monster. When I heard that someone had finally caught him in the act and gathered evidence of his crimes, I cried for the first time since this whole nightmare started. Mrs. Tobin, I'm so sorry about what happened to you. I read your file today, and I can't imagine how difficult this has been. Please, call me Margaret, and thank you, but I want to talk about you. You did something none of the rest of us managed to do. You figured out what was happening and fought back before it was too late. I was lucky. I had resources and support that some of the other victims didn't have. It wasn't luck, Alma. May I call you Alma? It was intelligence and courage. You recognized that something was wrong. You trusted your instincts. And you took action to protect yourself and your daughter. Margaret told me her story over the phone, filling in details that hadn't been in the case file. Her daughter Lisa had been going through a difficult divorce when Marcus's accomplice approached her at a coffee shop, striking up a conversation about the challenges of caring for aging parents. Within weeks, Lisa was convinced that Margaret was becoming a danger to herself and needed immediate intervention. The hardest part wasn't losing my house or my money, Margaret said. The hardest part was watching my daughter look at me like I was a stranger, like everything I'd taught her about critical thinking and independence had just evaporated. How is your relationship with Lisa now? Better? But it's taken time. She carries so much guilt about what happened, and I've had to work hard to help her understand that she was manipulated by professionals who specialize in this kind of psychological manipulation. Are you planning to testify in the trial? Absolutely. I want to look Marcus in the eye and tell him exactly what his greed cost me and my family. And I want other families to hear these stories so they can recognize the warning signs. Margaret and I talked for over an hour, sharing experiences and supporting each other in the way that only fellow survivors could. By the time we hung up, I felt connected to a community of women who'd faced the same predator and were committed to ensuring he never hurt anyone else. 2 weeks later, Margaret drove up from her new apartment to visit me in person. She was a small, elegant woman with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. We sat in my living room, drinking tea and sharing stories about our experiences with Marcus's criminal network. You know what strikes me most about this whole situation? Margaret said, settling back in her chair. Marcus and his accomplices assumed that elderly women were easy targets because we're supposedly less sharp, less connected, less capable of fighting back. They seriously underestimated us. They did. And I think that's because they confused age with frailty and assumed that being older meant being vulnerable. They didn't account for the fact that surviving 70-plus years on this planet requires considerable intelligence, resourcefulness, and strength. Margaret showed me photographs of the other victims she'd been in contact with. The 7 surviving women had formed an informal support network, sharing information about the legal proceedings and helping each other navigate the recovery process. We've been talking about doing something more formal, Margaret said. Maybe starting a foundation or organization that educates families about elder fraud and provides support for victims. I'd be very interested in something like that. We thought you might be. You're the one who actually stopped Marcus, who gathered the evidence that brought down his entire network. You're proof that these criminals can be defeated if victims know what to look for and how to fight back. That afternoon, Margaret and I drove to Serenity Gardens, the facility where Dr. Reeves had attempted to provide a fraudulent evaluation of my cognitive abilities. The facility was under new management and had implemented strict protocols to prevent future abuse. But seeing it again brought back memories of that humiliating day when Marcus thought he was finalizing his theft of my property. This is where he tried to have you declared incompetent? Margaret asked as we sat in the parking lot. Dr. Reeves was supposed to diagnose me with cognitive decline regardless of my actual mental state. When I started asking pointed questions about his methodology, he panicked and tried to end the evaluation early. What gave you the confidence to challenge him? I thought about that question, remembering the moment when I'd realized that Dr. Reeves was conducting a fraudulent evaluation rather than a legitimate medical assessment. I think it was anger, actually. Anger at being treated like I was incompetent when I knew I wasn't. Anger at watching my daughter being manipulated. Anger at the whole systematic attempt to steal my life's work and leave me powerless. Righteous anger can be a powerful motivator. It can, but it also has to be channeled intelligently. Getting angry without gathering evidence would have been useless. Marcus would have used my emotional response as proof that I was unstable. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. That's probably why so many of his other victims weren't able to fight back effectively. By the time they realized what was happening, they were so isolated and demoralized that they couldn't mount an organized resistance. As we drove back to my house, Margaret told me more about the foundation idea the survivors had been discussing. They envisioned an organization that would provide education about elder fraud, support for victims and their families, and advocacy for stronger legal protections for elderly people. We want to call it the Dorothy Chen Foundation, after the first victim we identified. Dorothy died without ever understanding why her son had taken everything away from her, but maybe her name can be associated with preventing other families from going through the same tragedy. I think that's a beautiful way to honor her memory. Will you help us get it started? I thought about Dorothy Chen, dying in a facility while Marcus spent her money. About Margaret, losing her house and her life savings to a man who saw her as nothing more than a source of easy money. About the 17 women whose trust had been weaponized against them by professionals who specialized in destroying families. Yes, I said. I'll help however I can. That evening, Sarah and I sat in my kitchen, planning how we might contribute to the foundation Margaret had described. Sarah's marketing background would be valuable for developing educational materials and outreach programs, and my experience as Marcus's intended victim would provide credibility for prevention efforts. Mom, do you think we can really prevent other families from going through what we experienced? I think we can help some families recognize the warning signs earlier, and we can provide support for victims who might otherwise feel too isolated or ashamed to seek help. What were the warning signs we should have recognized? I pulled out a notebook and started making a list based on everything I'd learned about Marcus's methods. Rapid relationship progression that leads to moving in together quickly. Financial crisis that creates dependency. Isolation from friends and outside perspectives. Gradual takeover of decision-making authority. Reframing normal aging processes as evidence of incompetence. Creating urgency around care decisions to prevent careful consideration of alternatives. Sarah read over my shoulder as I wrote. All of those things happened to us, but at the time, each one seemed reasonable or inevitable. That's exactly how these predators operate. They make each step seem logical and necessary so victims don't recognize the overall pattern until it's too late. How do we teach people to see the pattern? Education, awareness, and most importantly, encouraging families to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. Marcus counted on us dismissing our concerns as emotional overreaction or family dysfunction. 3 months later, I stood in the federal courthouse wearing my best suit and carrying a folder containing copies of all the evidence I'd gathered during my month in the servants' quarters. The courtroom was packed with victims' families, law enforcement officers, and journalists covering what had become known as the largest elder fraud case in state history. Marcus sat at the defendant's table, looking nothing like the confident manipulator who'd tried to steal my life. Prison had not been kind to him, and the man who'd once commanded my living room with architectural drawings and renovation plans now looked small and defeated. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the witness stand with steady steps, thinking about Dorothy Chen and Margaret Tobin and all the other women who deserved justice for what Marcus had done to them. Mrs. Henderson, the prosecutor began, please tell the court how you first became aware that the defendant was planning to steal your property. I looked directly at Marcus as I began my testimony, wanting him to see that the elderly woman he'd tried to victimize was now the one who would ensure his conviction. I overheard him on the phone with his accomplice, discussing plans to sell my house for a profit of $600,000, while having me committed to a facility against my will. For the next 4 hours, I described every detail of Marcus's systematic campaign of abuse and theft. I played the audio recordings that captured his criminal plans. I showed photographs of the servants' quarters where he'd forced me to live. I explained how he'd manipulated my daughter and tried to have me declared incompetent. When Marcus's defense attorney tried to suggest that I'd misunderstood his intentions, or that my age had made me paranoid and suspicious, I responded with calm precision. Counselor, I documented every conversation, every demand, and every attempt at manipulation. I have recordings, photographs, and written evidence of your client's criminal activities. This isn't about misunderstanding his intentions. This is about stopping a professional predator who made a career of destroying elderly women's lives. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Marcus was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, with additional state charges pending. His accomplices received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. After the trial, Margaret and I stood outside the courthouse with Sarah and several other victims' families, finally able to celebrate justice for the women who'd suffered at Marcus's hands. Dorothy would be proud, Margaret said, looking up at the courthouse steps where we'd just witnessed Marcus's conviction. All of them would be proud, I replied, thinking about the women who died before seeing their abuser brought to justice. 6 months after the trial, the Dorothy Chen Foundation received its nonprofit status, and we opened our first victim support center. Margaret served as executive director, I handled community education, and Sarah developed our outreach programs. We'd helped 12 families recognize elder fraud situations and provided support for 8 victims who were recovering from financial abuse. But the work that meant the most to me was the prevention education we provided to community groups, teaching families to recognize the warning signs of elder fraud, and empowering elderly people to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. Every time I spoke to a group about my experience, I thought about the woman who'd sat in the servants' quarters, listening to Marcus plan her destruction while feeling powerless to stop him. That woman had found her power, had fought back, and had protected not just herself, but countless other potential victims. Marcus had thought age made me vulnerable. Instead, it had made me dangerous. And now, every day, I was using that danger to protect other families from predators who thought elderly women were easy targets. The servants' quarters in my house remained empty, a reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. But more importantly, it was a reminder that surviving an attack wasn't enough. Sometimes, you had to fight back so effectively that your attacker became the cautionary tale instead of you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.